Okay, so now I think we should start. We're going into chapter 3 of the textbook. All right, so let's start. So chapter 3 is about interdependence and gains from trade. Here I'm showing you the QR code for the sample chapter that the publisher Cengage has provided, so that even if you don't have the textbook yet, you can download the sample chapter, at least for now. All right, so now let's start. In this chapter, we'll talk about why people or nations choose to be interdependent. And then we'll look at, because one of the principles that we saw in the first chapter is how trade can make everybody better off. So we'll see how that's going to happen. In particular, we'll look at two things. One is absolute advantage, and the other is comparative advantage. And we'll see how they are similar, but also how they differ. All right, so here we'll start with a Ask the Expert question. So here, this is about trade between China and the US. So here's the statement. Trade with China makes most Americans better off because, among other advantages, they can buy goods that are made or assembled more cheaply in China. So do you agree or disagree with this statement? And do you think economists would agree or disagree with this statement? All right, so now let's go to Slido. So this is an active poll. Do you agree or disagree? Trade with China makes most Americans better off because, among other advantages, they can buy goods that are made or assembled more cheaply in China. So you can choose between strongly agree, agree, uncertain, disagree, strongly disagree. You could also have no opinion or prefer not to answer if you want. But I do suggest that, because I'm going to only show the aggregate results, so that you can share your opinion. Okay, so I think I'll show you. So 39 of you agree, 7 strongly agree, 1 uncertain, 2 disagree, and let's see if there are others. Yeah, so okay. Thanks for your response. And now the real quiz. Do economists agree or disagree? So 100% agree, 50 to 99% agree, less than 50% or 0%. So you have 20 seconds to do this. Okay, you have 10 seconds left, so please hurry up. All right, time's up. So I'm showing you the results. 5 of you say 100%. The majority of you say 50 to 99%. Some of you say below that. And the answer is actually, surprisingly, 100%. So everybody, or all of the economists, agree on this particular statement. Okay, but here, what you get here is that this is a very rare situation, but 100% of the economists that this panel has surveyed basically say that they agree with the statement. There's no disagreement that so trade can make most Americans better off. So interdependence. So this is basically saying that you are relying on a lot of people around the world, even people you don't know, you never see before, to provide the goods and services that you enjoy. Here's one of the leading examples of this. So this is the Suez Canal, where there was a ship that was stuck in the canal that blocked worldwide transportation for quite a long period of time. And of course, that caused a lot of big problems. But the reason why a ship in Egypt would actually cause such a big problem, of course, that's because the global economy is interdependent. So once you clog this bottleneck, so everybody's affected. So here's one of the examples over here saying that. So it's a person from India steering a ship from Taiwan, which was rented from a Japanese company, insured by the UK, and with a Panama flag, bringing Chinese goods to Germany. And it was in Egypt's Suez Canal and blocked other ships from the whole world. Yeah, okay, so here you see how interdependent we are in the current economy. So trade can make everyone better off. So that's one of our principles. We'll see why people choose to do that. And the key thing, of course, is it's better for people to do this compared to otherwise. And there, the key thing is that there are gains from trade to be discovered, to be found. All right, so here we'll have an example. So remember, economists make simplified assumptions. So we assume there's only two countries, Dailiok and Taiwan, not to be confused. Yeah, so if there's any coincidence, it's a coincidence. And there are only two goods, chipsets and tea. And so there's only one resource to produce these two goods, labor, which is measured by hours. And so we want to see how much of both goods each country produces and consumes if they choose to be self-sufficient versus if trade is allowed. Okay, so now let's look at this. Example 1, the Dailiok economy has 50,000 labor hours per month available for production. You produce only two goods, chipsets and tea, so we already said that. And to produce one chipset, that requires 500 labor hours. To produce 1 ton of tea requires 10 labor hours. Let's take a look. So you have 50,000 labor hours. So if you put that all into chipsets, you get 100 chipsets. If you put some of that, if you only put 40,000 labor hours into chipsets, the remaining to tea, you get 80 chipsets and 1,000 tons of tea. And if it's half-half, then you can get 50 chipsets, 2,500 tons of tea. If you put the majority on tea, then you get 20 chipsets and 4,000 tons of tea. And if you put everything on tea, of course you get no chipsets, but you get 5,000 tons of tea. You can plot this, and so you can say that Dailiok has enough labor to produce 100 chipsets or 5,000 tons of tea, or any combination along this straight line, which is the PPF. You might find this figure slightly familiar, and it's because this is the same figure of chapter 2. Okay, so suppose Dailiok uses half of the labor to produce each of the goods and consumes all that alone. So then Dailiok's production and consumption will be 50 chipsets and 2,500 tons of tea. And so you can see it over here. So this is C1, which is what Dailiok would consume if it's self-sufficient. All right, so use the following information to draw Taiwan's PPF. Taiwan has 30,000 labor hours per month available for production. Again, you produce either chipsets or tea. And to produce one chipset, you need 625 labor hours. But if you wanted to produce 1 ton of tea, you need 25 labor hours. So your graph should be measured with T on the horizontal axis. All right, so let's take a look. So you have 30,000 labor hours, so you can either produce 48 chipsets by putting all of that into chipsets, or you can put all of that into tea, so you get 1,200 tons of tea, or you can put different combinations and get anything that's in between. All right? So suppose, again, Taiwan uses half of its labor on each of the goods, then what do you get? So you get 24 chipsets and 600 tons of tea. And that's what Taiwan would have to consume if Taiwan is self-sufficient. All right, so without trade, Dailiok consumes 50 chipsets and 2,500 tons of tea. And Taiwanese consumers, they get 24 chipsets and 600 tons of tea. So now we'll ask what happens when we're allowed to trade. So first we need to see how much of each good is produced, and then how much of each good is traded between the two countries. All right, so now we'll continue this example. So now two countries are going to choose different production points. A, Dailiok is going to produce 3,500 tons of tea. And I'm going to ask you, how many chipsets can Dailiok produce with the remaining resources? Draw this point on the PPF. And also, Taiwan is producing 48 chipsets. So how many tons of tea can Taiwan produce with the remaining resources? And plot this one on the PPF as well. So now prepare for the quiz. And so we should start. Okay, so the Dailiok economy has 50,000 labor hours. One chipset requires 500. 1 ton of tea requires 10 labor hours. If Dailiok is producing 3,500 tons of tea, how many chipsets can it produce with the remaining resources? So please do the calculation and put in your answers. Ooh, you have only less than 5 seconds left. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. Oh no. I'll give you some time. Please hurry up and make your answer. All right, so now I'm going to show the answer. So, okay, so the majority of you said 30, and some said 0, some said 1, some said 20 or 40 or 50. And the answer is indeed 30. So let's take a look. So if you produced 3,500 tons of tea, that means you're using up 35,000 labor hours. So you have 15,000 labor hours left to produce chipsets. And dividing that by 500, you get 30 chipsets. And it's plotted over here. So this is what Dialog would produce. So if it allocates the labor hours this way. Part B. So again, prepare for the quiz. Okay, so that one has 30,000 labor hours. To produce one chipset, you require 625 labor hours, and 1 ton of tea requires 25 labor hours. So if Taiwan produces 48 chipsets, how many tons of tea can Taiwan produce with the remaining resources? 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Please make your choice or make a guess. Okay, so now I'll show the answers. So your answers, 33 of you said 0%. Some of you said 20. A handful of you said different things. So what is the answer? And the answer is 0. So here, if for Taiwan to produce 48 chipsets, because each chipset requires 625 labor hours, that's using up 30,000 labor hours. And so there's nothing left to produce tea. So Taiwan would produce 0 ton of tea. So, okay, so you're on the y-axis. That's the point. All right, so now we're going to think about how they would trade. Here we have a definition of exports and imports. Imports are goods produced abroad and sold domestically. That's imports. And so you have a foreign producer and a domestic buyer. Exports are goods produced domestically and sold abroad. So you have domestic producers and foreign buyers. Okay, so now we'll continue with our example and think about, okay, so now what if the two countries will trade? They will trade 22 chipsets for 880 tons of tea. So, okay, so Dialog is going to export 880 tons of tea and import 22 chipsets. How much of each good is consumed by Dialog? And plot this consumption combination on Dialog's PPF. And now, so Taiwan is the flip side. So Taiwan will be exporting 22 chipsets and importing 880 tons of tea. And so how much of each good is consumed in Taiwan? So you have to do the calculation and plot this combination on Taiwan's PPF. All right, so now prepare for the quiz. Okay, so how much of each good is consumed in Dialog? So Dialog is producing 3,500 tons of tea and 30 chipsets. And it's going to export 880 tons of tea and import 22 chipsets. How much of each good is consumed in Dialog? Okay, so has everybody made your choice? Or you need some time to do the calculation? Just, oh my God, this is, I need a calculator. Yes. Oh, yeah, by the way, in the exam, you are allowed to bring a calculator. But anyway, so let's look at the answers. So a lot of you said 2,620 tons of tea and 52 chipsets. And yes, you are right. That's the correct answer. So let's take a look. So Dialog is producing 30 chipsets and 3,500 tons of tea. It's going to import 22 chipsets and exporting 880 tons of tea. So for imports, that's adding into the domestic consumption. So Dialog is going to consume 52 chipsets, but because of the export, you're subtracting that from your production. So Dialog is going to consume only 2,620 tons of tea. So that point is the blue dot, C2, on the PPF graph. And what you see here is that it's magic. Somehow, Dialog is consuming something beyond its own PPF. So, and compared to the first example where it's producing and consuming on its own, it's an improvement. See, the black dot is dominated by the blue dot. All right, so now we'll look at the case of Taiwan. So let's go. So Taiwan produces 0 tons of tea and 48 chipsets, and it's going to export 22 chipsets and importing 880 tons of tea. So how much of each good is consumed in Taiwan? Okay, time's up. Let's look at the answers. A lot of you said 26 chipsets and 880 tons of tea, and yes, you're right. Let's take a look. So Taiwan is producing 48 chipsets and 0 ton of tea, and it's going to import 880 tons of tea and exporting 22 chipsets. So 48 subtracting 22 out of 48, you get Taiwan is going to consume 26 chipsets, and you just consume the imports, so 880 tons of tea. And so it's out here in C2 in the blue dot here. And again, so it's completely dominating this black dot where Taiwan would be consuming if it was self-sufficient. In fact, C2 is beyond the PPF of Taiwan. So without this trade, it's impossible for Taiwan to achieve this level of consumption. All right, so let's summarize. Dialog is going to produce and consume 50 chipsets without trade. And with trade, it's going to consume 52 chipsets. So there's a gains from trade of 2 chipsets. And on the tea side, there's a gains from trade of 120 tons of tea. So Dialog is definitely better off. But that does not mean that Taiwan is worse off, because without trade, Taiwan is going to only consume 24 chipsets. But now it's going to consume 26 chipsets. So Taiwan also gains 2 chipsets from this trade. And for tea, Taiwan is going to gain 280 tons of tea. So both countries are better off. So you know why one of our 10 principles of economics is trade can make both countries better off. So then you have to ask the question, where do these gains come from? That's the interesting question. The first concept we'll look at is what we call absolute advantage. This is the ability to produce a good using fewer inputs than another producer. So in our example, the absolute advantage for tea is Dialog, because for Dialog to produce 1 ton of tea, it only requires 10 labor hours compared to 25 labor hours in Taiwan. But what's interesting here is that the absolute advantage in chipsets is also held by Dialog, because it requires 625 labor hours to produce 1 chipset in Taiwan, but only 500 labor hours in Dialog. So what you get here is that Dialog actually has absolute advantage in both goods. So here you say, wait a minute, so why is there still gains from trade if one country has absolute advantage in both sides? As you saw in our example, Taiwan decided to specialize in chipsets. But why is that so? I mean, apparently Dialog has the absolute advantage in chipsets. And so here, the key thing is that 2 countries can gain from trade when each of them specialize in the goods that they can produce at the lowest cost. But the real question is, what cost are we talking about here? So what does that mean? So we have different measures of cost. We talked about absolute advantage. So this is measuring the cost in terms of input required to produce this good. And there's another measure, which is opportunity cost. So what is the opportunity cost of a chipset? It's the amount of tea you have to give up that you could have produced using the labor hours to produce this one chipset. So here we're going to introduce the second concept called comparative advantage, which is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. So here we have the principle of comparative advantage, which states that each good should be produced by the individual that has the smaller opportunity cost of producing that good. And so the whole thing here is that because you should specialize according to the competitive advantage. And that's where the gains from trade come from. I mean, if you think of most people in the society, they specialize in doing one job. So I'm a professor, so I'll be a professor. Some people are good at being a salesperson, so they go out to boost the sales of different companies. Some have the specialize in being entrepreneurs, and so they start new companies and then nurture it to grow. So here you see specialization, and the reason why you have that is because of comparative advantage. All right, let's go back to our example. So for Dialog to produce one chipset, you need 500 labor hours. And to produce 1 ton of tea, you need 10 labor hours. For Taiwan, it's one chipset for 625 labor hours, and 1 ton of tea is 25 labor hours. So for each country, calculate the opportunity cost of producing each good, and then which country has the comparative advantage in producing tea, and which one has the comparative advantage in producing chipsets. All right, so are you ready for the quiz? Get ready, and so we shall start. So Dialog can produce one chipset in 500 labor hours, or 1 ton of tea in 10 hours, and Taiwan can produce one chipset in 625 hours, or 1 ton of tea using 25 hours. So which country has comparative advantage in the production of tea? Dialog, Taiwan, or don't know? DDD. Which one? All right, time's up. So let's look at your answers. So a lot of you said Dialog, some of you said Taiwan, nobody said don't know. And the answer is Dialog. So most of you got it right, or actually 2/3 of you got it right. Okay, next one. Which country has comparative advantage in producing chipsets? So Dialog, Taiwan, or don't know? Again, DDD. Okay, so you have less than 5 seconds, so please hurry up. I think most of you already made a decision. So let's now show the answers. 47 of you said Taiwan, some of you said Dialog, nobody said don't know. So let's take a look. It is Taiwan. So for Dialog, producing one chipset using 500 labor hours, but using this 500 labor hours, you could have produced 50 tons of tea. And so the opportunity cost for one chipset is 50 tons of tea. And of course, the flip side is that the opportunity cost for producing 1 ton of tea is 0.02 chipsets. So for Taiwan, it's the flip side. So you can do the same calculation. So 625 labor hours, you could produce one chipset, or if you divided that by 25, you get 25 tons of tea. So the opportunity cost for one chipset is 25 tons of tea. And the flip side, of course, is the opportunity cost for producing 1 ton of tea is 0.04 chipsets. So here you see that because the opportunity cost for producing chipsets is only 25 tons of tea for Taiwan, that's lower than 50. So Taiwan has the comparative advantage in chipsets. And the flip side is that because Dialog has the opportunity cost of 0.02 chipsets per ton of tea, which is lower than the 0.04 chipsets for Taiwan. So Dialog has the comparative advantage for producing tea. All right, so here's the opportunity cost for producing. And so for Taiwan, it has the comparative advantage of producing chipsets. And for Dialog, it's producing tea. All right, so here we're going to talk about gains from trade. Gains from trade arises from this comparative advantage, from each country specializing in the good, which has comparative advantage, which has a lower opportunity cost. And so by doing that, you can boost total production in all countries. And the world's economic pie is bigger, and so everybody can gain from trade. So this is possible because each country has their own comparative advantage. Everybody has different opportunity costs. So you pick whichever you have the lowest opportunity cost to produce and specialize on that. Of course, this will not work if, unfortunately, all the countries have the same opportunity cost. Then too bad, there's no gains from trade. You should remember this because if you think of it, when you graduate, you want to be different. You want to have a competitive advantage so that you know that, oh, so I'm good at this, I have the lowest opportunity cost, so I should take this job, as opposed to other people who are taking other jobs. They specialize in different aspects of the economy, but you find whichever job is best for you that has a competitive advantage. And if you're exactly a copy of your classmate, then you two have the exact same opportunity costs and there's no gains from trade possible. So it's good that we're different because then we can all specialize and realize gains from trade. All right, so one thing that's not talked about here is prices. So the price of the trade must lie between the two opportunity costs. In our example, the trade was 22 chipsets for 880 tons of tea. So the price of trade is one chipset versus 40 tons of tea. And that's greater than Taiwan's opportunity cost of chipsets, which is 25 tons of tea, but lower than Daidok's opportunity cost of a chipset, which is 50 tons of tea. And the reason is obvious. I mean, if you need to pay a price higher than your opportunity cost of producing this good yourself, you would not want to import that good. And of course, if exporting this good, you can get a higher price than your opportunity cost for producing this, then you will want to produce it and export it. Of course, we didn't really talk about where this 22 chipsets versus 880 tons of tea came from. So that's something that we will explore in the next chapter and beyond about prices. But at least we know that it's between 25 and 50. All right, so now we'll look at a different example. So for California, we have 10,000 labor hours per month. You can either produce 1 pound of coffee with 2 hours, or you can produce 1 bottle of wine with 4 hours. So here you have California. And then you have Mexico, again, another 10,000 labor hours per month, where producing 1 pound of coffee requires 1 hour, and producing 1 bottle of wine requires 5 hours. So which country has the absolute advantage in producing coffee, and which country has the comparative advantage in producing wine? All right, so prepare for the quiz. So take a look. Now that we'll start the quiz. So, okay, so which country has the absolute advantage in coffee, and which country has the comparative advantage in wine? Both in California, both in Mexico, or California for coffee, Mexico for wine, or California for wine, Mexico for coffee. So you have 5 seconds left. 4, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. If you have not made a choice, please make a guess. And we'll look at your answers. So 10 of you said California has absolute advantage in coffee. Mexico has comparative advantage in wine. 3 of you say California has both. 27 of you said Mexico has an absolute advantage in coffee, while California has comparative advantage in wine. 7 of you said Mexico has absolute advantage, has both. Okay, so, and the answer is actually following your majority. Let's take a look. 27 of you got it right, although not, yeah, quite a few were wrong. Let's think carefully. So what is the absolute advantage? So you have to produce with the least input. So fewer resources are required to produce 1 pound of coffee. Mexico, you only need 1 labor hour, but for California, you need 2 labor hours. So Mexico has the absolute advantage in coffee. What about comparative advantage in wine? So you need to be able to produce wine at the lowest opportunity cost. So what is the opportunity cost for producing wine in Mexico and California? Here, California's opportunity cost is only 2 pounds of coffee because the labor hours required for producing wine is 4 hours, and divided by 2 labor hours per pound of coffee, you get 2 pounds of coffee. But for the 25 versus 5, Mexico has an opportunity cost of 5 pounds of coffee for 1 bottle of wine. So California has the comparative advantage of producing wine. Okay, so now we'll go to the next Ask the Expert question that we'll be seeing in this chapter. Some Americans who work in the production of competing goods, such as clothing, furniture, are made worse off by trade with China. Do you agree or disagree? And do you think the economists would agree or disagree with this statement? So first we'll have a poll. So do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Some Americans who work in the production of competing goods, such as clothing, furniture, are made worse off by trade with China. So you strongly agree, not sure, disagree, or strongly disagree. You could have no opinion or prefer not to answer, that's fine. Okay, so the answers are still coming in, but I can show you the current answers. So 15 of you strongly agree, 25 of you say agree, 3 are uncertain, 18 disagree. All right, so what do you think about economists? So now this is predicting what the survey results of economists would be. Do economists agree or disagree with this statement? 100%, 50 to 99%, 1 to 49%, 0%, or you don't know? You have 30 seconds, and I think now you have like 15 seconds left. Okay, time's up. Let's look at your answers. So a lot of you said 50 to 99%, and some of you guessed 100%, and some said below 50%. And the answer is 50 to 99%. So 96% of the economists surveyed agreed on this statement. 4 were not sure. 0% disagreed. So gains from trade is something that has a stronger consensus for everybody. So at the end of this lecture, we'll think about a hypothetical situation. So you're watching an election debate on TV. One of the candidates says, we need to stop the flow of foreign vehicles into our country. If we place a tariff on foreign vehicles, our domestic vehicles production will go up and Taiwan would be better off. So it's just like, so if you want to buy imported cars like Toyota or Mercedes-Benz or BMW or Volvo or Ford. So the idea here is that we should stop the flow of these foreign import cars. And that would help domestic vehicle production like Yulong or Nazijie. So will Taiwan be better off if we limit car imports? That's one question. The second one is, will anybody in Taiwan be better off if we limit car imports? And in the real world, does every person in the country gain when we reduce this restriction on imports? So this is a little bit more complicated. Okay, there is no right or wrong in this question, so this is a pool. Will Taiwan be better off if we limit car imports? Yes, no, maybe, don't know. So this is just a survey, so you're not really tested on this. Okay, so let me show your answers. Some of you say yes, some of you say no. A lot of people say maybe. Here you know that asking the question, will Taiwan be better off if we limit car imports? Yeah, it's debatable. And of course, for some people, say no, it's not. That's against the candidate. All right, so now who in Taiwan will be better off if we limit car imports? This is an open-end question, so you can type in who do you think is going to be better off here. So please type in your answers. It doesn't need to be a whole sentence. You can just put like say, oh yeah, like car producers, yeah, like that. Local car manufacturers, domestic car producers. Yeah, okay, so yeah, so now you see the word cloud is coming in. Yan Kai Tai, yeah, good. A giant, yeah, okay. I really love this word cloud. Instead of one answer at a time, we can see everybody's answers coming in. A lot of variations, but it's basically the domestic car producers. Actually, somebody named Luxogen, that's the brand. Yan Kai Tai is the owner of Yulong. So there are people who will be better off if we limit car imports. Okay, so let's go to the next question. So in the real world, does every person in the country gain when restrictions on imports are reduced? If you think yes, everybody can gain. So now please name a person that will not gain. If you think everybody will gain from reducing restrictions on imports, then you say none. This is not about Taiwan. This is in general. Does everybody in a country gain when restrictions on imports are reduced? So you can name which person. Me? Okay, so you're not going to gain. None, okay. Okay, yeah, so I do apologize that the wording is a little bit strange here, but I wanted you to name somebody that would not gain from reducing trade restrictions. Okay, yeah, so sorry for the double negative, and so some of your answers might be misled, but this is just a poll. We're not going to judge you on is your answer correct or not. But yeah, so in general, the key thing is that when there are trade restrictions, the domestic producers are happy. So if you reduce this trade restriction, what's going to happen is that the domestic producers will not be happy. If you don't care about foreign producers, they'll be happy. But local consumers would also be happy because you're allowed to get a lot of new products, more variety or cheaper products. And so, of course, transportation companies like Evergreen, these shipment companies, they would also be happy because of that. All right, so yeah, so thank you very much for all of your different answers. I really enjoyed the word cloud. But now we're going to summarize the whole chapter. So this is on interdependence and trade. Those are good. So the key thing is that you can have everybody enjoy greater quantity and variety of goods and services. And it's because of comparative advantage. So this is being able to produce something at a lower opportunity cost instead of just being able to produce the good with fewer inputs. That's absolute advantage. And the gains from trade comes from comparative advantage. Then one of our 10 principles is elaborated here, that trade makes everyone better off. So because everybody, you can specialize on whatever activity which you have a comparative advantage. So this principles of comparative advantage applies to countries as well as to people. So in our example, we saw different countries, but you can think of yourself, different individuals within the society, you could also have gains from trade like this. And because of this principle of comparative advantage, that's why most economists advocate for free trade. Even though they know that, yeah, I mean, there are losers when free trade is allowed. So the domestic producers might not be happy facing foreign competition, but actually for goods that you export, domestic producers would actually be happy. I mean, think about, like, say, chipsets. Taiwan has the comparative advantage of producing chipsets around the world. So TSMC is producing like crazy and then exporting to the whole world. And of course, that's good. So depending on the industry, depending on it's an export or an import, well, so different people are affected. So that's why the statement is trade can make people better off because of competitive advantage. And okay, so here's the homework for this chapter. And I think that's the end of this chapter. So let's see if we have any questions. So if you have any questions, you can type that in the Q&A section. So if we don't have any questions, we can end this class early. So I think I'll conclude the class today. and see you guys on Friday.